NATO leaders are gathering in Ankara this week for a summit at a critical moment for the alliance. Russia's war against Ukraine, instability in the Middle East, and pressure to strengthen Europe's defenses have made Turkey more important to NATO than it has been in years. For President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, hosting the summit is a major diplomatic opportunity, but it comes amid an unprecedented domestic crackdown on the opposition. Our correspondent Julia Hahn reports on what Erdogan stands to gain and why, for many allies, security concerns may be overshadowing democratic ones.
Just a few years ago, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan was often at odds with his NATO allies. Now he's welcoming alliance leaders to Ankara for a crucial summit and hearing unusually warm words from some of NATO's most influential figures.
Erdogan's a great leader, very strong person, great military. He loves Turkey and he's doing a great job. He's a respected man, a respected leader, and he's been a friend of mine.
We can learn a lot from what Turkey is doing here. And this is needed because we live in a more dangerous world.
But beyond the rhetoric, analysts say NATO needs Ankara even more than it did a few years ago.
Turkey has certainly become a more important ally. No one can overlook Turkey's location next to Iran, next to Syria, next to this zone of instability in the Middle East, but also between Europe and the zone of instability in the Middle East.
Just look at the map. Turkey sits between Europe, the Black Sea and the Middle East, close to many of the flashpoints NATO faces today. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine has also given Turkey a much bigger role in Europe's security. But it's not just its geographical location which makes it so important. Turkey has NATO's second largest military after the United States and a fast-growing defense industry producing drones, missiles and warships. President Erdogan argues those contributions deserve more recognition.
The indispensable contributions that Turkey makes to European security are sometimes overlooked.
But the NATO summit also comes while political freedoms here inside Turkey continue to be eroded. Pressure on the opposition has reached unprecedented levels. The arrest of Istanbul Mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu, Erdogan's biggest political rival, sparked the country's largest protests in years. In the run-up to the NATO summit, demonstrations and public gatherings have been banned in the capital Ankara. And authorities have detained more than 200 people, citing security concerns. But among them were lawyers, activists and academics. Many Turkish journalists from independent media outlets have also been denied accreditation to cover the event, prompting criticism from press freedom groups.
Well, it's no secret that Turkey is seen as an increasingly authoritarian regime by many of its allies, including its European allies. The summit is taking place after years of democratic backsliding, pressure on the opposition, also on civil society and definitely journalists.
And that puts NATO in an awkward position. It describes itself as an alliance founded on democracy, individual liberty and the rule of law. So will allies publicly criticize Erdogan?
Geopolitical challenges are so important to NATO and Europe right now that they are not willing to let a values-based discord to become the dominant theme at the NATO summit. I think Turkey's domestic issues will be far less important and far less emphasized during this summit.
That will only benefit Erdogan, and hosting NATO leaders also brings prestige after years of strained relations with many Western governments.
President Erdogan has not really been invited at senior level meetings in many NATO countries because of Turkey's democratic backsliding and divergence of issues. So this is an important geopolitical moment to say, I'm back also in the alliance.
For Erdogan, the summit could mark a diplomatic comeback. For NATO, it's a reminder of a difficult reality. In a more dangerous world, international security priorities often outweigh democratic concerns.
Let's expand on that with Bradley Bowman. He's the senior director of the Center on Military and Political Power at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies in Washington, D.C. Welcome back to DW. Now, can Erdogan do what he wants in his country as long as he remains a reliable NATO ally?
I hope not. Sometimes there's a suggestion that we have to choose between security and liberty or security and democratic principles. And I've long thought that that is a false choice. I think we can strengthen security and strengthen our democracies at the same time, and we should. But let's remember, as your report just highlighted, that the preamble of the 1949 North Atlantic Treaty, everyone's familiar with Article 5, but they skip right over the preamble. And the preamble explicitly says that the alliance is not founded for the purpose of conquest. It's founded on the purpose of founded on principles of democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law. So those questions related to the democratic health of a country, the liberty of its citizens, whether it's the rule of a man or the rule of law, are not tangential to the alliance. And anyone who suggests otherwise doesn't understand the founding principles and purposes of the alliance. We're not building militaries for the fun of it. We're building militaries to protect something, and we're building an alliance to protect something, and what we're protecting is democracy, liberty, and the rule of law. And unfortunately, we've seen problems from Erdogan on all of that.
Has the alliance ever known how to address authoritarianism within its ranks? Because founding member Portugal, for example, was a dictatorship at the time the alliance came into being.
It's a great question. I'm not suggesting this problem is new. We've seen problems, frankly, with Orban. We've seen other problems in the alliance for a long time. There's no mechanism in the treaty itself to evict a member. And some people say that, because we need unity, which we certainly do with the alliance, given the threats the alliance confronts, that we shouldn't criticize. I reject that premise as well as a false choice. Just like a family needs to have tough discussions with the family while recognizing there's threats coming from outside the family, we can walk and chew gum as an alliance, and Erdogan is a problem. We can recognize the threat from Russia, and we should also recognize that Erdogan buys air defense systems from the leading threat to the alliance, Russia, that he embraces Hamas after the worst single-day murder of Jews since the Holocaust, and he's cozying up with the People's Republic of China. That's an ally not acting like one.
How uneasy is NATO about this increased dependence on Turkey?
I don't know if we're dependent. I'm not sure I'd phrase it that way. I recognize that Turkey is an important country. They are an important geostrategic location. They have one of the alliance's largest militaries. Erdogan has focused on building his personal relationship with Trump. And if you look at the press conference last Wednesday, that's clearly paying dividends. The president called him a fine gentleman. That's just not a term I would use for someone who hosts Hamas after October 7th and thinks what they did on that horrific day is just fine. So I think there's a little marketing campaign going on from Ankara, if you will. And I think we should call balls and strikes. I try to do that here at home as an American, and we should do that with Erdogan as well. And once again, he's buying air defense systems from Russia. He's embracing Hamas. And he has dozens and dozens of Chinese 5G telecommunications entities operating in Turkey that have been an espionage and cyber concern. I think we can speak all these truths at the same time while still being committed to NATO, which is indeed a grand strategic asset for the United States and other alliance members.
You say you wouldn't call it a dependence, but from the European perspective, Europe is getting ready to buy an increased amount of armament from Turkey. So they are, maybe because they're trying to move away from the dependence of the U.S. in a way, because they see the American president as an unreliable partner, they are moving closer to Turkey. What could the blowback be, or how could that fire back at the European allies in NATO?
Well, each of those are a choice. Those decisions to purchase things from Turkey is a choice. Europe doesn't have to do that. It has other options. Admittedly, there's been things emanating from Washington, including statements and policies on the Greenland issue, which was an absolute disaster. We've hurt ourselves with some of this. But I'd say rather than becoming reliant on Erdogan's Turkey, which is not, he spins it like he wants to be a full-fledged supportive NATO member. What he's really trying to do is build an independent defense industrial base that is supporting his policies. And let's remember, Turkey's constantly threatening another member of the alliance, Greece. And look what they're doing in Cyprus. So there's the marketing campaign and there's the truth. And I think purchasing more weapons from Turkey would be unwise for our European allies. And that's not me trying to say you should buy everything from us, but you should look at what you're helping Turkey do if you purchase more weapons from Erdogan.
Is this marriage of convenience then doomed to fail?
No, I mean, they're a member of the alliance. I'm not aware of any effective means to evict them, and I don't see the political will to do that. Of course, not in the White House, not in the Pentagon, and elsewhere. But I'd say a better policy, a better reality begins with speaking the truth and highlighting that, no, you're not going to get readmitted to the F-35 program unless you get rid of the S-400.
Sorry to jump in there, but who would you say is, at this point in time, the most likely candidate to actually do that, to talk tough to Erdogan?
You know, ideally, it would be the President of the United States. But I think the President of the United States at times is not getting the best advice that he needs. He doesn't have someone like an H.R. McMaster in there right now telling him, Mr. President, you know, look at the S-400. Look at what his relationship with Hamas. Look at his, why is Turkey associated with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization? Why does Turkey want to be a full member, along with Iran, of an organization led by Russia and China? And so I'd love to see President Trump playing this role.
It's not going to be Trump from what I'm hearing you say. Who is it going to be then? Is anybody going to step up to the occasion?
I hope so. Unfortunately, it looks like it's going to have to be some of our NATO allies, and I don't see a leading candidate right now because, as your first question suggests, I think some are creating this false dichotomy between security concerns and democratic concerns, and I see that as a false choice. And if you want democracy, you better focus on security. If you want security, you better take attention to your democracy. In the medium to long term, at least, they're the same thing for NATO.
Bradley Bowman from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Ian Lesser is an expert on U.S. foreign policy and security policy. He's currently a distinguished fellow and advisor to the president at the German Marshall Fund and joins us now from Ankara. Ian, good to see you. President Erdogan is hosting NATO leaders now at a moment when Turkey seems more strategically important than it has been in recent years. How much leverage do you see that giving Erdogan inside the alliance?
Well, I think it's a question of strategic importance, as you say, especially in light of what has happened with the war in Iran, but not just that. Turkey in the Black Sea, Turkey in other settings in relation to Russia. But beyond that, I think there is apparently a very close relationship between President Erdogan and President Trump. And that, I think, can affect the mood here at a time when there's a lot of anxiety about what allies are going to find when President Trump arrives.
And Turkey has maintained ties with Ukraine and Russia at the same time. How is that being seen within the alliance? Is that useful diplomacy within NATO? Is it strategic ambiguity? Is it something else?
Well, Turkey has a way of describing this. They say they're for Ukraine, but not against Russia. You know, Turkey has been doing a lot with Ukraine in terms of defense cooperation, defense industrial cooperation. That's all perfectly true. They also, I think, make clear that there's value for them and for the alliance in keeping a line open to Moscow. I think quietly, many in the alliance would agree with that, although clearly Turkey is sort of on one end of the spectrum when it comes to all of this. So we'll see. That's likely to be a topic of some discussion here over the next days.
To what extent do you see that potentially putting them in a role of power broker now going forward?
I don't know that they really want to play that role. Clearly, Turkey can play a role as a facilitator. There's no question about that. But I think there's a broad recognition that there's going to be some sort of a settlement, or at least a ceasefire in the war in Ukraine. It's going to require the engagement of the parties, and above all, it's going to require the leverage that Washington may or may not have, first and foremost. But if that's possible, then I do think Turkey can play a role as well.
NATO wants more defense spending and stronger defense production. How important is Turkey's growing defense industry? We're talking about drones, missiles, naval capabilities for the alliance.
I think it's very important. I mean, obviously, it wouldn't surprise you that Turkey is very eager to showcase this at the summit. In fact, there's a very large side meeting that's focused exactly on that. But this really does make a big difference at a time when Europe and NATO as a whole are trying to rethink defense arrangements in Europe, above all, to get more capability. Where is this capability going to come from? Where are the defense goods and services going to come from? Turkey can supply many of these, but I think Ankara is very keen to make that clear here in Ankara, the Ankara summit.
The reporting that we saw a little bit earlier highlighted the fact that this summit is coming amid a crackdown on opposition voices in Turkey. And I'm wondering to what extent you think that that might be addressed by others in the alliance in this meeting.
I doubt that this will be front and center in any way because of the obvious sensitivities. There are different views really about this within the alliance, for sure, and many allies have been very critical. But I think, it's one of those issues, and there are others involving other countries that are sort of in the room, but not necessarily on the agenda. I think that's how I would characterize it.
Ian Lesser, Distinguished Fellow at the German Marshall Fund, joining us from Ankara. Thank you so much for your time.